Hello everyone, welcome back. It's early morning. Not for you, for them. Year 793, coast of Northumbria. The monks at Lindisfarne wake up to gulls, cold floors, and the same breakfast as yesterday. Nothing exciting, unless you're really into porridge. The monastery is calm. Bells ring, sheep complain, ink dries on parchment. The monks expect prayer, chanting, maybe an argument over who misplaced the bread. They don't expect company. Life here is predictable. Wake up, pray, copy texts, maybe shear a sheep if the weather's decent. Excitement means someone sneezing in the middle of mass. Privacy is non-existent. Everyone knows who snores, who steals an extra spoon of stew, and who has the bad habit of leaving sandals in the wrong spot. Lindisfarne isn't a fortress. No walls, no guards, no weapons lying around. It's basically a library with livestock. The idea that armed men might sail in from across the sea feels about as likely as a pizza delivery in the 8th century. Technically possible, but nobody's ordering it. Out on the water, though, long ships glide closer, low, sleek and silent. To anyone watching, they'd look strange. Carved prows like dragons, oars dipping in rhythm, sails catching the grey morning light. But no one is watching. The monastery has a great bell, but no lookout. Security here is lock the door and trust in God. By the time anyone notices movement on the shore, the raiders are already sprinting. Axes in hand, shields on arms, voices loud in a language no monk understands. They're not here for theology. They're here for whatever fits in a sack. Chalices, reliquaries, cattle, bread, maybe a portable monk or two. The monks freeze. Some run barefoot across the rocks. Some try to hide. Some just stand, unsure whether to pray or panic. Either way, it doesn't help. Within minutes, the monastery that smelled of parchment and smoke now smells of seawater, sweat, and fear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later describe this as shocking, catastrophic, unforgettable. For the people inside, it was less poetic. One moment you're chanting psalms, the next moment a stranger is moving your furniture without asking. The raid is fast, a few minutes of shouting, clashing and grabbing. The raiders strip the altar, tear open chests, pocket manuscripts, seize livestock. The monks scatter like pigeons, and the pigeons probably scatter too. From the monks' perspective, this is the end of the world. From the raiders' perspective, it's a shopping trip with no cashier, and they don't plan to linger. Rule 1 of raiding: get in, get out, and don't wait for the neighbours. Some monks are killed, others dragged away to be ransomed or enslaved. The survivors will remember forever, and their writings will echo across Europe. To them, this isn't just one raid, it's a divine warning, proof that punishment has arrived from the sea. To the raiders, it's Tuesday, and the loot matters. Silver chalices, jewelled crosses, livestock that can walk itself to the ship. Value isn't spiritual here, it's weight. How many men does it take to carry this? How many mouths can a goat feed back home? The raiders think in practical terms. Some things are destroyed simply because they can't be carried. Golden manuscripts are ripped apart for the covers, parchment tossed into the mud. A cow that won't move quick enough gets left behind. The logic is brutal, but efficient. If it can't sail, it's not useful. They even try to haul absurd stuff. Massive church furniture, relic chests bigger than 3 men. Imagine the archaeologists centuries later, finding what's basically the skeleton of a monastery. Wait, hold it. If you're still here, headphones on, underwear secured, dignity optional. Congratulations, you're now trapped in history our way. Hit like and subscribe. We drop this kind of chaos twice a week. Alright, back to the raid. The monks, meanwhile, try desperately to save what little they can. Some hide relics, others clutch at the altar. But the raiders aren't interested in arguments. They shout, they grab, they leave. To them, speed is survival. Imagine being a villager nearby, hearing the bells at the wrong hour. By the time you reach the coast, the ships are already pulling away. You see smoke, you hear crying, and out at sea, the dragon-prowed silhouettes grow smaller. You realise you're too late. and the world just got more dangerous. Later generations would look back at Lindisfarne as the official beginning of the Viking Age. But the men rowing away don't know that. They didn't wake up this morning planning to start history. They planned to get rich, drink later, and maybe exaggerate the story at the feast. Still, something changes. Christian Europe learns that prayers don't stop ships, bells don't scare oarsmen, and saints don't carry swords. From this point on, coastal life comes with a new background worry. Every dawn, the horizon might sprout sails. The raid is over in minutes, but the ripple lasts centuries. The raid doesn't last long, but the looting part feels endless. Inside the monastery, everything has some kind of value. A silver cross, a chalice, even a polished candlestick. If it glints, it goes into a bag. Take that bowl, it's wood. Still a bowl. That's how practical the logic is. The raiders aren't picky. To them, the monastery is a supermarket, where everything is free, and the checkout process is screaming. The manuscripts are especially strange. Monks spend years painting gold leaf into pages, binding them in covers studded with gems. The raiders open the books, see all the careful lettering, and shrug. The words mean nothing to them. The covers, however, pop right off. Problem solved, pages flutter into the mud. Gold ends up in someone's pouch. Imagine a monk watching his life's work. Years of copying, every letter perfect, torn apart in seconds. He tries to protest. You can't just rip that. Why not? It's scripture. Yeah, not anymore. Dry, simple, brutal. Livestock join the loot. Goats bleating, cows shoved along, chickens flapping under arms. The ships will smell like a barnyard by the time they shove off. Not that anyone cares. Food that walks itself is just efficient packing. One monk tries to block the path of a cow being dragged toward the beach. A raider nudges him aside with the kind of patience you reserve for someone hogging the aisle at the grocery store. No malice, just inconvenience. And then there are the humans. Captives aren't just collateral, they're business. Thralls, as the Norse call them. Bound hands, roped together, marched to the ships. Monks, servants, maybe villagers who ran too close. Some will be ransomed back, others kept as labour, others sold far away, where no one knows their name. For the raiders, people are as valuable as silver. It feels cruel now, but back then it was standard practice. You raid, you take thralls, nobody questions it. A young raider might even boast later. I grabbed 2 silver cups and a monk with good teeth. The monastery itself doesn't get flattened. Burning everything would be a waste. But setting a few fires? That's just a calling card. Smoke drifting into the sky makes sure the neighbours know what happened. It's like leaving a review. Only the review says, easy target. Would raid again, and the monk's still breathing? They're left with ashes, empty shelves, and awkward questions. Who lost the keys to the treasury? Who should have rung the bell earlier? Who's going to explain to the bishop why the holy relics are now halfway to Norway? Let's pause on the economics for a second. A raid like this isn't random violence. It's basically risk investment. Ships, crews, weapons, all of that costs time and labour. The loot has to be worth the trip. Silver, gold, livestock, thralls. These are liquid assets in the 8th century. Liquid in the sense that you can sell them fast, not because they're stored in jars. Every item gets judged by portability. Too big, too heavy, leave it. The rule of thumb. If it takes more than 4 men to move, it's not worth delaying the getaway. Except cows. Cows are always worth it. There's also the problem of noise. Thralls don't exactly march quietly. Chickens don't either. The longship loading zone must have sounded like a petting zoo being robbed at dawn. But the raiders don't mind. They've done this before, and they'll do it again. One raider supposedly joked to a monk clutching a chalice. You pray to it? Yes. Good. Then you won't need it anymore. By the time the sun rises fully, the monastery is a shell. The altar stripped, shelves empty, cloisters silent. The survivors stumble through smoke and broken doors. A few chickens scratch in the dirt, confused that their coop is gone. A cow left behind chews calmly, unaware it dodged a one-way ticket overseas. The raiders, meanwhile, row back to their ships with bags heavier, bellies hungrier, and captives tied near the benches. A goat tied to the prow complains loudly. Someone tells it to shut up. The goat doesn't. Whose goat is this? Doesn't matter. It's everyone's dinner. Not if it keeps yelling. For the monks, the raid feels apocalyptic. For the raiders, it's routine. They don't write chronicles about it. They don't see it as a turning point in European history. They see it as one morning's work, plus a promise of mead later if the seas stay calm. The irony is that Lindisfarne becomes legendary. The raid makes it into chronicles, sermons, and centuries of fear. Yet for the people actually on the ships, it's just another Tuesday with better than average loot. Loot, fire, and thralls. That's the summary. A quiet monastery turned into a warehouse raid, plus livestock bonus. And the rule still holds. None of it matters unless the ships make it back home. Because a chest of silver is useless if you drown with it. The longships shove off from Lindisfarne, creaking under the weight of silver, livestock, and very confused chickens. To villagers on the shore, it looks like triumph. Sails high, hulls full, but the raiders know better. A raid isn't truly finished until the crew rows home and sets foot on familiar soil, and that is never guaranteed. The sea is unpredictable. Storms appear without warning. A calm morning can turn into an evening of waves taller than the mast. One bad squall and the silver you risked your life for goes straight to the bottom. The goat you tied near the prow, washed away with a single wave. For all their skill, the raiders sail, knowing fortune can flip like a coin in someone else's hand. Even without storms, the voyage back is its own punishment. Clothes stay damp for days, salt stiffens every seam, and the benches rub skin raw. Nobody talks about comfort on a longship. It doesn't exist. You sit where you're told, you row when it's time, and you try not to think about how many blisters you already have. Then there's the stomach. Seasickness doesn't spare the strong. Even seasoned fighters lean over the edge, losing breakfast while trying to keep time with the oars. The unlucky ones vomit on their neighbour, which is one way to test crew morale. The smell of sweat, fish, and half-digested bread mixes in the air, and you realise the real enemy isn't always on land. Food doesn't help much either. Supplies are limited. Dried fish so salty it burns the mouth. Flatbread that cracks like stone, and cheese that gets more ambitious with age. You eat because you must, not because you want to. Some chew slowly, some choke it down fast. Either way, the aftertaste lingers longer than most raids. The loot rattles in the hull, reminding everyone why they risked this misery. Chalices clink, livestock kick, captives murmur. It's wealth, yes, but it's also noise. Every crash of silver against wood makes you think of ears listening on shore. Every bleat risks drawing attention before you're out of reach. Because raids attract retaliation. Villages don't stay helpless forever. Smoke signals travel fast. By the time you're halfway to open water, armed locals may already be waiting down the coast. Surprise is gone, and once it's gone, so is your main advantage. Sometimes the danger is immediate. Archaeologists find skeletons near coastal battle sites, men with deep cuts in the skull, broken jaws, arrowheads still lodged in bone. They're not nameless warriors from sagas. They're reminders that raids often ended with men face down in mud. For every ship that came home with treasure, another limped back with half its benches empty. But risk wasn't just swords and storms. Disease followed the crew too, crammed together for days, sharing food, water and air. One sick man could infect a dozen. A fever doesn't respect bravery. It just spreads, and there's no healer on board, unless you count the guy who swears by onion broth. Still, men signed up. Why? Because the payoff was real. Even one silver chalice split among the crew meant more than months of farming rocky soil back home. It was worth sore muscles, bad cheese, and the occasional arrow. Wealth was heavy, but poverty was heavier, and camaraderie softened the misery. Sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing jokes, grumbling about blisters, it built bonds. When the sea got rough, men leaned on each other, literally. If your benchmate slacked, you dragged him back in rhythm. The longship wasn't democratic, but it was equal in suffering. Everyone got wet, Everyone got hungry, and everyone prayed the goat would stop kicking. Archaeology shows this dual truth. Graves filled with weapon wounds, alongside hoards of silver buried for safekeeping. Both stories happened at once. For some, glory. For others, a sudden end. The sagas later polished this into heroism, but the reality looked more like exhaustion, punctuated by occasional terror. And the weirdest part? The raiders didn't see it as unusual. Seasickness, hunger, the constant threat of drowning. It was just part of the package. If you wanted silver, you endured it. If you wanted to stay home, you farmed. Neither option was easy. One made you miserable on the ocean, the other made you miserable in the fields. The raid on Lindisfarne looks legendary in hindsight. To the crew rowing back across the grey waves, it felt ordinary. Heavy hulls, sore arms, an awkward goat, and the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, the storm clouds on the horizon were already watching. The raid ended on shore, but the cost kept rowing with them. Longships weren't majestic cruise liners. They were stripped down, practical machines that looked more like giant wooden sneakers, fast, narrow, and with absolutely zero thought given to comfort. The hull was built thin, almost alarmingly so, which made the ships lightweight and quick. Great if you wanted to sneak up on a coastline. Less great if you wanted to sit down without feeling like the ocean was poking you directly in the spine. Each ship carried anywhere from 20 to 60 men. That's not a suggestion. That's not a luxury head count. That's the whole gang. Their weapons, whatever food supplies could be stuffed in, and sometimes livestock that didn't exactly file for tickets. Picture 50 men, sitting shoulder to shoulder, plus a goat who had no idea it was on an international trip. The seating plan was brutally simple. Benches along the sides, each tied to an oar. No picking your spot, no swapping because you prefer the view. You sat where the rowing dictated, like the ancient version of a budget airline seat assignment. And unlike a budget airline, nobody served peanuts, unless you counted the dried fish someone smuggled in their pouch. There was no deck to hide under, no cosy cabins, just open planks. Everyone got the same amenities: rain in your hair, seawater in your lap, and whatever wind direction the gods decided. Sleeping? Also on those planks. Pillows? Your own arm, if circulation wasn't important to you. Some men dragged animal hides on board to double as bedding, but after 3 days of constant spray, they smelled less like furs and more like wet dog. Discipline was everything. Oars weren't just pieces of wood. They were your assigned responsibility. If your timing was off, the entire row cursed you in 3 languages. If you fell asleep mid-stroke, congratulations, the ship just drifted sideways, while everyone shouted your name like a bad karaoke host. Captains did not tolerate improvisation. You rowed in rhythm, or you rowed in shame. And rhythm wasn't always romantic. Oar handles rubbed blisters so deep that men joked you could see daylight through your palms. Not that anyone was laughing when they still had 6 hours of rowing left. Calluses were badges of honour. Ugly, painful badges that made holding a cup later feel like squeezing it with a cheese grater. On calmer waters, some crews added chants to keep time. These weren't hymns or heroic ballads. More often, it was one guy yelling "row" like he had swallowed a drum. Sometimes someone improvised a rhyme, but humour had to be quick, because if you made the rowers laugh too hard, and they lost rhythm, the captain noticed. And captains weren't known for their appreciation of slapstick comedy. Personal space didn't exist. Elbows were constant weapons, knees pressed into strangers, and if the man in front of you leaned back, congratulations, you had a beard in your face for the next 3 hours. Privacy wasn't a thing. You relieved yourself over the side, hoping the wind didn't choose that exact moment to betray you. Everyone smelled bad and nobody apologised. Yet somehow, this system worked. Long ships could skim across oceans and then dart up shallow rivers nobody thought were navigable. Imagine locals standing by a tiny stream thinking, "We're safe." Then suddenly 30 wet Scandinavians appeared like a terrible magic trick. Speed and manoeuvrability were the real terror weapons. The crew knew it. They weren't luxury passengers. They were the engine, the GPS, and the cleaning crew all rolled into one. It wasn't glamorous, but if you kept rhythm, kept balance, and didn't fall overboard, you were part of one of the most efficient naval systems the world had ever seen. Of course, efficient doesn't mean pleasant. The constant wetness gnawed at morale. Boots rotted, clothes grew stiff with salt. Sitting down felt like straddling a puddle that refused to dry. Some men carried little pouches of herbs, not for medicine, but to sniff as a break from the smell of 50 damp bodies fermenting in the sun. Still, longship crews took pride in it. They weren't farmers stuck on wagons. They were raiders with a reputation. If the bishop wrote a terrified letter about your arrival, you knew you'd done your job. But none of that glory erased the fact that most of your day was spent rowing in silence, wondering if the goat in the corner was judging you. Meals on a longship weren't about taste, they were about survival. If you signed up hoping for variety, you'd be disappointed before the first wave hit. Breakfast, dried fish. Lunch, dried fish maybe with flatbread. Dinner, surprise, it's fish again. At best you could trade half your ration for a crumb of cheese that squeaked like it regretted being eaten. Water was loaded into barrels, but barrels don't stay fresh. After a few days, the taste turned strange, then sour, then into something no one dared describe. The fix was simple: beer. But not the strong kind you imagine at a feast. This was watery, barely alcoholic beer. The point wasn't fun. The point was to avoid stomach-churning bacteria. Every sip was basically a compromise. A little buzz, fewer germs, and still the taste of sadness. Food storage was an art in disappointment. Salted meat was technically edible, but each chew felt like gnawing wood that had rolled in the ocean. Some men swore they chipped teeth on it. Others said it doubled as armour in emergencies. No saga mentions the hero of the salty beef, but maybe it should. Flatbread travelled better, though it grew rock hard with time. Crews softened it by dipping it in beer, creating something between a snack and soggy cardboard. Nobody called it delicious. They called it good enough to not die. A glowing review in Viking terms. Meals were never private. Everyone sat shoulder to shoulder, biting and chewing in full view of each other. You knew your neighbour's chewing style better than his family tree. Grease dripped into beards, crumbs fell into laps, and one careless sneeze could make half the row stare in betrayal. It was dinner theatre, with no intermission and no option to sit somewhere else. And then came seasickness, the eternal passenger. No matter how tough you were, the sea had ways of humbling you. Experienced raiders leaned over the side as often as newcomers. The motion of the ship didn't care how many swords you owned. The rule was simple. You vomited, then you got back to rowing. Nobody clapped, nobody comforted you. They just shuffled a little further down the bench and hoped the wind wasn't blowing in their direction. The smell on board? A complex perfume, salt water, damp wool, sweat, half-rotten food, and stomach acid. Some men tried remedies, chewing herbs, staring at the horizon, even lying flat on planks to trick their balance. Others just accepted their fate. Row, puke, row again was as normal as wake up, eat, sleep. It wasn't glorious, but it was efficient. Even when food stayed down, it wasn't always plentiful. Long voyages stretched supplies thin. Bread sprouted green patches nobody wanted to identify. Meat sweated salt. Cheese hardened into something you could use as a weapon. Some crews scraped the mould and kept chewing. Hunger made you an optimist. Complaining didn't refill the barrel. Rations doubled as morale tests. If men still joked about the fish, spirits were fine. If silence spread across the benches, the mood sank with it. Humour was a seasoning they couldn't afford to lose. A sarcastic quip about beer tasting like angry water did more for morale than another bite of jerky. Cooking on board? Almost impossible. Fires on wooden boats were frowned upon for obvious reasons. Sometimes crews stopped ashore to cook stew or roast meat. But on the open sea, it was all cold meals. The closest thing to variety was whether you chewed in daylight or under stars. Of course, no longship story is complete without livestock. Goats, chickens, Maybe a pig or two joined the ride. Their fate was simple: either stay alive until the crew needed meat, or add to the general soundtrack of the voyage. Chickens clucked, goats stared, pigs complained. Some men swore animals judged them, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Sharing food wasn't optional. If you ran out early, you begged, borrowed, or sulked until someone shared. Hoarding rations made enemies fast. Trust was survival, and trust was built partly on not being the guy who hid cheese under his cloak. Every voyage told the same story. Supplies started hopeful, tasted worse over time, and ended with men debating whether old leather straps counted as edible. By the end, nobody cared about feasts. They cared about making it to shore before the bread crumbled into dust. That was Viking nutrition. Fish, bread, beer, and whatever stayed down. Not gourmet, not romantic, but enough to keep rowers alive long enough to terrify monks. Finding your way across the sea without GPS was either genius or insanity, depending on how you looked at it. For the Vikings, it was just Tuesday. They didn't carry maps full of squiggly coastlines. They carried memory, instinct, and a willingness to pretend the sun was more reliable than it actually was. At night, stars were the main guide. Crews learned constellations not for romance but for survival. The North Star, that was their best friend. If it moved, you were drunk, or the world was ending. By day they used the sun, not fancy instruments, just shadows. Put a stick on the deck, check the shadow, hope the clouds weren't in the mood to ruin your plan. Coastlines doubled as navigation aids. If you could see land, you followed its shape, tracing bays and cliffs. Of course, this only worked if you wanted to hug the coast. The moment you struck out into open water, it became a high-stakes guessing game. Follow the sun, hope the horizon didn't lie, and maybe pray your goat didn't look more confident than you. Then there was the mystery of the sunstone. Sagas mention it as a crystal that revealed the sun's location even in cloudy skies. Did it exist? Maybe. Some archaeologists found crystals that could bend light in useful ways. Others think it's just a legend that sounded too good to fact-check. Imagine a Viking squinting through a shiny rock while his crewmates rolled their eyes. If nothing else, it gave people something to argue about besides fish rations. Of course, even the best navigation meant nothing when the weather had other plans. The North Atlantic didn't care about your schedule. Calm 1 hour, chaos the next. Storms appeared like they were waiting behind curtains, eager to throw your ship around for fun. Rain hammered, waves slapped, and suddenly your carefully measured shadow stick was just a wet twig rolling across the deck. Rowers weren't just fighting distance, they were fighting nausea, exhaustion, and the creeping thought that maybe the ocean didn't actually want them there. Seasickness could wipe out half the crew's energy before an enemy ever swung a sword. You could survive raiders, but good luck surviving your own stomach. Capsizing wasn't rare. A wave too high, a wind too sharp, and the longship could flip. They were light and agile, which made them fast but also fragile. Crews bailed water constantly, with buckets or even helmets. If you stopped for 5 minutes, the ocean politely reminded you that it had more water than you had buckets. Winter made it worse. Ice froze on beards, ropes stiffened, and fingers turned useless. Imagine trying to row with hands that felt like frozen meat sticks. Gloves existed, but once soaked, they became cold sponges. More than one raider probably wondered why they left home, just to risk turning into a popsicle with a sword. And yet, long ships worked. Their design let them skim shallow rivers, cross seas, and beach on coasts where nobody expected visitors. Flexibility was their secret weapon. If one route looked too stormy, they cut across another. If winds turned hostile, rowers picked up the slack, swearing under their breath but rowing anyway. Storm stories became folklore. Crews told tales of thunder shaking the sea, of lightning splitting masts, of men thrown overboard and never seen again. Some swore they saw sea monsters. Others probably just saw big waves and blamed it on imagination. Either way, it made good storytelling around the fire later. What's remarkable is that despite the chaos, raids still worked. Ships landed where they needed to, often earlier than locals thought possible. Villagers assumed storms would keep raiders away. Instead, the raiders showed up soaked, shivering, smelling of vomit, but on time. Punctuality, Viking style. Navigation wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Between stars, sun, coastlines, and maybe a shiny rock, they crossed thousands of miles. They reached England, France, the Mediterranean, even rivers deep into Russia. Not bad for people with no compasses, no satellites, and an unshakable faith that the horizon wasn't lying. So while storms tossed them, while clouds laughed at their shadows, while goats bleated judgment, they still rode on. Because as miserable as it felt, the reward waited on the other shore. Land to raid, silver to steal, stories to tell, and maybe, just maybe, a break from eating dried fish. Life in Scandinavia didn't wait for your permission. The soil gave you what it wanted, which was usually disappointment. Rocks poked through every field, and winters dragged on like guests who didn't take hints. Summers were short, crops short, tempers short. If you pulled barley from the ground, you celebrated. If you pulled stones, well, congratulations. You had building material for yet another wall nobody asked for. Barley was the main grain, but it wasn't generous. Rye sometimes worked, oats if you were lucky. Wheat? That was a fantasy, better to believe in dragons. Families turned whatever they grew into, porridge or bread, so dense it could knock out a neighbour, if you threw it. Vegetables appeared, but sparingly. Turnips, onions, cabbage. Enough to keep you alive, not enough to write poetry about. Livestock helped, though helped is doing a lot of work. Sheep and goats provided milk, cheese and wool. Cows gave milk, but feeding them in winter was like volunteering for bankruptcy. Chickens were practical, pigs efficient. Horses were valuable, but mostly for status and transport. In lean years, some families ate the horses too, despite pretending they didn't. The problem wasn't just food, it was people. Populations grew, but land didn't. A farm could only be split so many times before someone ended up with a strip of dirt that could barely hold a cabbage. Eldest sons inherited the good plots. Younger sons inherited frustration. Daughters? Often married off to patch alliances, though they sometimes had better choices than landless brothers. It led to conversations like this. Father: the farm goes to your brother? Second son: so what do I get, father? You get character. Second son: sighs: I'll start carving a boat. Staying home meant endless scraping against the soil, praying for mild winters, and watching your older brother act important. Leaving meant uncertainty, but also possibility. A raid could turn you from the extra son into the man with silver bracelets. A single successful trip across the sea could change a life faster than 10 harvests at home. Communities noticed. Villages needed more than just food. They needed iron, timber, salt, and luxury goods to show off. Scandinavia wasn't rich in resources, at least not the flashy kind. Raiding plugged that gap. Silver from England could be melted into coins or jewellery. Slaves could be sold in markets. Even basic supplies stolen abroad could tide a family through another brutal winter. Weather pushed them too. Some years the climate shifted colder. Harvests shrank. Famine loomed. Raiding wasn't just greed, it was insurance. If your farm couldn't cover your family, you sailed. If your family couldn't cover the farm, you sailed. The decision was simple math. Row now or starve later. And raiding wasn't always chaos. It was organised like any other job. Men gathered in spring, pooled resources to build or repair ships, and planned targets. They didn't just wake up and say, let's hit a monastery. They discussed timing, distance, and how many goats could survive the voyage. Sometimes it sounded less like warriors planning glory, and more like co-workers planning overtime. Even within villages, ambition divided people. Some wanted to stay and till the soil, others wanted to risk the sea. A few probably wanted to avoid both and hide in the woods, but the opportunity was real. Returning raiders strutted into villages with foreign silver, new weapons, or exotic goods. They became living advertisements for leaving. It's easy to imagine a casual exchange at the feast table. Stayer. I harvested enough turnips to last the winter. Raider. Cool. I brought back a chest of silver and a story about stabbing a guard in France. Stayer. Right. Pass the turnips. Raiding also offered social mobility. A poor farmer could return as a wealthy man. Wealth meant land, land meant influence, and influence meant people actually listened when you spoke. Staying home rarely offered that ladder. The soil didn't promote anyone. The sea, for all its danger, did. Of course, risk balanced reward. Not every ship came back. Storms sank vessels. Defenders killed raiders. Some expeditions ended with nothing but exhaustion and empty hands. But even with losses, the potential gain outweighed the certainty of scraping a living from unforgiving ground. Women played into the equation too. With men gone raiding, women managed farms, households, and communities. They had rights unusual for the time: property ownership, divorce, influence in trade. But they also felt the pressure. If raids failed, if silver didn't come back, it was women who faced the shortages first. Villages depended on raiding not as a hobby, but as a safety valve. It wasn't about endless conquest. It was about balance, balancing too many mouths against too little soil, balancing hunger against opportunity, balancing the hope of silver against the risk of storms. So when young men climbed aboard longships, it wasn't just wanderlust, it was necessity disguised as adventure. They weren't chasing legends, they were chasing survival. The soil at home whispered one truth: there wasn't enough. The sea promised another. There might be more. And when choices narrow to starve slowly or row quickly, the decision isn't really a decision at all. When Vikings looked for targets, they weren't browsing travel brochures. They wanted wealth that was easy to reach and poorly defended. That meant monasteries, coastal villages, and trading posts. Monks prayed a lot, but prayer didn't come with fortifications. Farmers had livestock, but livestock can't swing swords. Ports had goods, but most guards weren't expecting guests arriving by dragon-headed boat at sunrise. Monasteries were especially attractive. They stored silver, books with gold lettering, ornate crosses, and sometimes barrels of wine. From the Viking perspective, a monastery wasn't a holy sanctuary. It was a vault with no security system. The fact that monks also lived there was unfortunate for the monks. For raiders, it meant quick plunder with minimal effort. Villages along the coast offered food, livestock, and captives. A herd of cows could mean months of meals. A barn full of grain could keep a crew fed through winter. People themselves were valuable too. Captives became thralls, slaves to work farms back home, or to be sold in markets abroad. For many raids, human cargo was as important as silver. Ports and trading towns were riskier but tempting. Goods from far-off lands, glass, spices, silks, moved through them. A quick strike could yield treasures far beyond what Scandinavia could produce. Of course, ports sometimes fought back harder, but the potential payoff made the gamble worthwhile. The rewards funded everything else. Silver could be melted into coins or crafted into jewellery. Gold crosses became pendants, with no memory of their original purpose. Livestock was slaughtered or bred. Grain was eaten immediately or stored against famine. Captives were worked, traded, or sold for cash. Every raid was both a payday and a supply run. Wealth wasn't just about comfort, it was about reputation. A man who returned with silver could buy land, host feasts, and hand out gifts. In a society where status mattered, generosity made leaders. Raiding didn't just feed families, it built hierarchies. A poor man could return as a chief. A chief could return as a legend. It also fueled the cycle. One raid paid for the next. Silver bought better weapons. Captives worked farms so more men could leave again. Grain kept communities alive while others sailed. Success made raiding not just a habit, but a system. It wasn't random chaos, it was recurring income. Europe learned this quickly. Regions that thought they were too remote to matter found themselves on Viking maps. Raids moved inland by rivers, turning even small towns into targets. The range expanded because the rewards justified the risk. If the coast was empty, the river valleys were next. For the Vikings, the calculation was simple. Who has wealth and who can't protect it? That equation led them across Britain, France, Ireland, and beyond. Targets weren't chosen out of malice. They were chosen out of math. The irony is that some monasteries and towns rebuilt after raids, only to be hit again later. A rebuilt monastery with new treasures looked like a grand reopening sign. For raiders, it was less sacred renewal and more thanks for restocking. At home, those treasures reshaped society. Silver flowed into Scandinavia, changing trade, wealth distribution, and power structures. The same crosses, chalices, and coins that terrified Europe became everyday symbols of success in Viking halls. The pattern was clear. Raids weren't random explosions of violence. They were targeted strikes with predictable rewards. For the men rowing longships, the logic was clear. Take silver, take food, take captives. Repeat as necessary. Raiding took men away, but villages didn't sit idle when ships disappeared over the horizon. Work didn't pause. Farms had to be maintained, animals cared for, and households kept running. Without that, a successful raid would still return to failure. The rhythm of daily life never stopped, and women held much of that rhythm together. Fields needed constant attention. Barley, rye, and oats grew only if someone weeded, watered, and harvested them at the right time. Men might plough before sailing, but tending the crops through the summer often fell to women. They organised planting, supervised harvests, and ensured that every usable grain was stored properly. Without those efforts, winter supplies would vanish no matter how much silver a raider brought back. Livestock added another layer. Sheep had to be sheared for wool, goats and cows milked daily, and chickens guarded from predators. A cow wasn't just food, it was an investment, providing milk, butter, and calves. Managing animals required constant care. Women decided which animals were bred, which were slaughtered, and which needed special attention. These weren't small choices. They determined whether a family thrived or stumbled through the year. Property rights gave women a kind of authority unusual for the medieval world. A widow could inherit her husband's land. A wife could, under some circumstances, divorce her husband and reclaim her dowry. Women signed contracts, traded goods, and oversaw estates. Archaeological finds of scales, weights, and keys in female graves point to their roles as economic managers. A key wasn't a trinket, it symbolized control of household stores and wealth. The household itself was an engine of survival. Women ran storage rooms, directed servants or thralls, and allocated resources. Grain had to be rationed, dairy monitored, tools maintained. Every decision shaped how well a family endured harsh seasons. Silver and loot might make headlines in sagas, but stored grain and preserved fish decided who lived through the winter. Archaeology occasionally complicates the picture. The Birka warrior grave is one example. Buried with weapons, armour, and symbols of command, the individual was long assumed male. Later studies suggested otherwise. If correct, it challenges the assumption that warfare was exclusively male. Was she an exception, a commander, or simply misinterpreted? The debate continues, but the find reminds us that Viking society was more flexible than stereotypes suggest. Meanwhile, women in ordinary roles carried invisible weight. They spun wool into yarn, wove cloth for clothing and sails, and brewed ale. Ale wasn't a luxury. It was a safer drink than water and a staple of the diet. Producing enough for households and workers required planning, supplies, and constant labour. Cloth production was equally demanding. A single sail required months of spinning and weaving. The idea that raids alone sustained Viking life misses the quiet industries that supported them. Marriage and family ties gave women influence too. Marriages weren't just personal, they were strategic. A union merged farms, linked families, or forged alliances. A well-placed marriage could elevate a family's status more effectively than a raid. Dowries included land, animals, or valuables, and women retained some claim to them. That economic weight made women central players in community negotiations. Day-to-day life wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Homes needed constant repair. Tools wore down and required sharpening. Children needed care, discipline, and training in the basics of farming, trading, or household work. Elderly family members required support. Thralls, if present, had to be managed. Each task was small, but together they defined survival. Seasonal rhythms shaped everything. In summer, households worked fields intensively. In autumn, harvests were preserved. Grain dried, fish salted, meat smoked. Winter turned homes into workshops, where cloth was woven, tools repaired, and stories shared around fires. Women oversaw that cycle, ensuring no step was skipped. Myths won, and hunger followed. The image of Viking society often centres on raiders storming monasteries. But back home, women maintained the structures that allowed those raids to happen. A farm that collapsed while men were gone meant fewer ships could sail the next year. A household that thrived meant raiding could continue. Their work was the backbone, invisible in sagas but undeniable in archaeology. It wasn't equality in the modern sense. Men still dominated leadership and warfare. But within the household and community, women exercised power that shaped outcomes. They weren't spectators. They were decision makers, managers, and, in rare cases, fighters. Viking society endured because its foundation at home was stable, so while men rode and fought abroad, women kept villages alive. Crops grew, animals thrived, trades were managed, and children raised. The sagas recorded raids, but survival was written in everyday tasks performed far from the noise of longships. When people imagine Vikings, the picture is usually raids, burning churches, stolen silver, villages in panic. But raiding was only half the story. The other half was trading, and in that arena the Vikings built one of the most extensive networks of the early medieval world. Their longships weren't just war machines, they were also cargo carriers, moving furs, walrus ivory, iron timber, and slaves across thousands of miles. Evidence for this global reach is strong. Arabic silver coins, dirhams minted in the Abbasid Caliphate, turn up in Viking hordes all over Scandinavia. Some graves in Sweden contain piles of them, often cut into small pieces, suggesting they were used as weighed silver currency rather than as coins in the formal sense. These weren't rare finds. Archaeologists have uncovered tens of thousands of dirhams, clear proof that Scandinavian merchants connected with Islamic markets through river routes deep inside Eastern Europe. Those routes were lifelines. Viking traders navigated the Volga and Dnieper rivers, linking the Baltic to the Caspian and Black Seas. From there, goods flowed into Byzantium and the Middle East. A Scandinavian crew might row past Russian forests, stop at trading posts along the way, and eventually present themselves in bustling markets where merchants spoke Arabic, Greek, or Persian. The Norse didn't need to understand every word. Silver spoke its own language. What did they bring south? Furs from Arctic animals, slaves captured in raids, and products of northern lands, amber, iron, and honey. In return, they took home silver, silks, glassware, wine, and spices. The contrast must have been striking. A man raised on rye bread and dried fish might suddenly taste dates or sea-coloured textiles unlike anything in his homeland. These imports weren't just luxuries, they signalled status back home. Owning silk or foreign beads showed connections, wealth, and influence. Byzantium was another magnet. The empire needed mercenaries, and Vikings filled that demand through the Varangian Guard. This elite corps, serving directly under the emperor, was famous for its loyalty and ferocity. They weren't simply hired soldiers, they became part of imperial ceremony and politics. Standing in the halls of Constantinople, Norse warriors saw mosaics, marble palaces, and trade networks larger than anything in Scandinavia. They returned with gold, artifacts, and stories that expanded horizons far beyond their fjords. The dual identity of raider and trader is one of the most interesting aspects of Viking life. The same ship might attack a coastal village in one season and appear as a merchant vessel in another. A crew could raid one monastery, then carry that loot to a distant market and trade it as legitimate goods. Reputation was flexible, shaped by context. In a Frankish port, they might be treated as bandits. In a Russian market, as valuable trading partners. Archaeology supports this blended role. Graves across Scandinavia contain not just weapons, but imported objects. Beads from the Middle East, Byzantine coins, even peacock feathers. These aren't items raiders would typically carry away from a battlefield. They point to steady, organised exchange. Some households must have relied more on trade than plunder, suggesting that the Viking economy was more balanced than its violent image implies. This network stretched surprisingly far. Norse artifacts appear in Ireland, England, France, Russia, Turkey, and as far as Central Asia. In return, foreign goods reached Scandinavian homes. A farmer in rural Norway could hold a coin stamped with Arabic script, completely foreign to his language, yet valuable for its silver. A woman in Sweden might decorate clothing with beads crafted in distant lands. These links made even remote villages part of a global system. The Viking approach to trade was pragmatic. They didn't impose one cultural model, but adapted to each setting. In England, they integrated with local economies. Along the Volga, they adopted river-based trading practices. In Byzantium, they sold their fighting skills. This adaptability made them unusually successful middlemen, able to move between worlds that rarely interacted directly. It's worth noting how raiding and trading reinforced each other. Raids created supply, captured slaves, stolen goods, and looted silver. Trade turned those supplies into broader wealth, moving them through markets that valued what Scandinavia could provide. The two sides weren't separate industries, they were parts of the same system. Without trade, raids would have produced short-term gains. With trade, those gains multiplied across regions. The scale of Viking trade also challenges the stereotype of an isolated north. Scandinavia in this period wasn't cut off, it was plugged in. Goods and ideas moved in both directions. Some Norse adopted foreign styles of dress, copied coin designs, or borrowed technologies. At the same time, European and Middle Eastern merchants learned to expect Norse traders in their markets, building relationships that lasted generations. Even daily life back home reflected these connections. Imported beads appear in women's jewellery, silver hoards became savings accounts, hidden for security, and sometimes never recovered. Exotic fabrics, even in small amounts, signalled prestige at gatherings. These items made households visibly wealthier and reinforced the idea that trade success could elevate status as much as battle victories. The global network Vikings built wasn't a side project. It was central to their world. Raiding gets attention because it was loud, violent, and terrifying to the people on the receiving end. But the quieter work of trade explains why the Viking Age lasted centuries. Silver, not just swords, sustained it. Without steady links to markets abroad, Scandinavian communities would have remained small and isolated. Instead, they became nodes in a system stretching from Baghdad to Dublin. In the end, Vikings weren't just destroyers, they were connectors. They bridged regions, carried goods, and blurred the line between violence and commerce. They raided, yes, but they also bargained, navigated, and integrated. Their legacy isn't only carved into chronicles of fear, it's buried in coins, beads, and artifacts that prove how global their world really was. When you think Viking loot, it's easy to picture silver cups, golden crucifixes, or jewel-studded relics. But the real jackpot wasn't shiny metal, it was people. Human beings were the one resource that always had a buyer, and the Vikings treated slavery like a business model. They called them thralls, captured in raids, dragged from villages, or taken off monasteries. Thralls became the main export product of Scandinavia. A sword or a necklace could only be sold once. A thrall could cook, farm, haul timber, or, more lucratively, be sold again. Think of it as the Viking version of renewable income, except the only thing renewable was human misery. The scale was staggering. Raids across Britain, Ireland, and the Slavic lands supplied captives non-stop. Historians point out that the very word slave in English traces back to Slav, because so many Slavic people were captured and sold during this era. When an ethnic group becomes shorthand for unpaid labour, you know the industry was massive. Dublin became a hub for this trade. Under Viking control, it wasn't just a settlement, it was one of Europe's busiest slave markets. Picture a medieval Costco, but instead of barrels of grain, you had terrified villagers lined up for inspection. No membership card required, just a ship and a willingness to treat people like livestock. Buyers came from all over: Irish kings, Norse settlers, even foreign merchants who knew Dublin was the place to stock up. And it didn't stop at Ireland. Viking ships carried thralls eastward, along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. These routes connected Scandinavia to the Islamic Caliphate and Byzantium. Archaeologists have dug up tens of thousands of Arabic silver dirhams in Swedish soil. The coins didn't get there by accident. They were payment for furs, amber, and yes, slaves. Vikings might not have read the Arabic inscriptions, but silver works like a universal debit card. At home, thralls were the engine that kept farms running. Scandinavian soil wasn't generous, and farming it required endless back-breaking labour. Clearing land, sowing grain, hauling wood, tending animals. Jobs free farmers preferred to avoid landed squarely on thralls. In Viking households, status wasn't just measured by jewellery or weapons. It was also about how many thralls you owned. A wealthy farmer might brag about livestock. A truly wealthy one bragged about the people forced to look after it. Domestic work counted too. Thralls prepared food, fetched water, and maintained fires. Some were craftsmen, forced to make tools or spin wool. Others built ships or repaired buildings. Basically, if a task was boring, painful, or dangerous, it landed on the thralls. Free Vikings still worked, but thralls were the labour cushion that gave them time to raid, trade, or show off at feasts. Legally, thralls had almost no rights. Viking law codes made sharp distinctions between free, freed, and enslaved. Killing a thrall wasn't murder, it was property damage. The owner got compensation, and that was the end of the case. Imagine traffic court, except the fine was for running over a human being. Some thralls could technically be freed after years of service, and a few stories mention freedmen rising to modest status. But most never escaped the system. Internationally, the Viking role in the slave trade was huge. They didn't invent slavery, it already existed across Europe and the Middle East, but they industrialized the supply chain. Captives from northern raids flowed south, and foreign buyers provided the silver that fueled the Viking economy. Slaves weren't a side product of raids. In many cases, they were the main target. A monastery might hold gold, but it also held monks, nuns, and peasants, all of whom could be chained and sold. Archaeological finds underline the reality. Shackles, collars, and chains show up in Scandinavian sites, not as rare oddities, but as regular tools of life. Some graves of Viking elites even contain these objects, probably as symbols of wealth and dominance. Place names across Scandinavia include routes connected to slavery, proof that enslaved people weren't hidden, they were part of the landscape. The economics were simple, but brutal. Thralls were barter units. One healthy young worker might be traded for livestock, weapons, or a pile of silver. Demand was steady, so supply had to be constant. Raids became less about glory and more about inventory. Leaders understood this. A single raid could bankroll the next voyage, not through gold, but through chained captives waiting to be sold. For the victims, the impact was devastating. Coastal communities shrank as the strongest and youngest were taken away. Families were torn apart, populations destabilized. To ordinary Europeans, the Viking Age wasn't just a time of raids. It was a time when the threat of abduction hung over daily life. To the Vikings, it was a reliable revenue stream. Even the sagas often focused on warriors and honour, occasionally mentioned thralls. They appear as background figures, reminders that the social pyramid rested on their shoulders. Free men fought and travelled, women managed farms and trade, but thralls filled in the labour gap that made all of it possible. Without them, the Viking system would have sputtered. It's tempting to focus on the more glamorous parts of Viking life, the ships, the weapons, the dramatic raids. But if you really want to understand how their world worked, follow the economics. And those economics point straight to slavery. Thralls weren't an unfortunate side note. They were the fuel, the workforce, and the export that linked Scandinavia to markets from Dublin to Baghdad. So yes, the Vikings terrified Europe with their raids, but the real impact was quieter and longer lasting. Generations of people uprooted, bought, sold, and worked until they collapsed. It wasn't romantic and it wasn't glorious, but it was central. The Viking Age ran not just on sails and steel, but on the backs of thralls. If you lived in Europe around the late 700s and early 800s, Viking raids weren't a distant rumour. They were the kind of headline that kept repeating until people got sick of hearing it. And unlike today's headlines, you couldn't just turn the page. You had to prepare for the possibility that a ship full of armed Scandinavians might show up at your doorstep. The fear was real enough to reach into religion. Some Christian liturgies added a special prayer. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. That's about as clear a sign as you can get that people were scared. Imagine a whole community deciding the best defence strategy was to update the official prayer list. Of course, prayer alone didn't stop raids. So communities began building defences. Coastal monasteries and towns started throwing up walls and towers. Villages that once treated the sea as a highway for trade began treating it like a constant threat. Fortifications weren't elaborate castles yet, but they were strong enough to slow down raiders who preferred easy targets. The days of monasteries sitting open like unlocked banks were ending. Kings noticed too. Early medieval rulers often struggled to control their own territories, let alone their coastlines. Viking raids forced them to adapt. In England, this meant reorganising defences into what later became known as the Boer system. Fortified towns linked by a network that allowed faster response. These weren't perfect, but they made random hit-and-run raids less profitable. If you're a Viking crew looking for loot, a walled town with a garrison suddenly looks like too much trouble. The Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne and his heirs, faced similar problems. They already had wars on multiple fronts, and now ships were gliding up rivers that were supposed to be safe highways. The Seine and Loire turned into Viking thoroughfares. Paris itself was attacked more than once. Local counts and bishops scrambled to organise militias, reinforce bridges, and raise ransoms when defence failed. Because yes, ransoms became part of the playbook. If you couldn't beat the Vikings, sometimes you just paid them to leave. That system even got formalised. Some rulers collected taxes specifically to fund Viking payoffs, the medieval equivalent of protection money. The Vikings didn't complain. They took the silver, left, and sometimes came back anyway. For local rulers, it was a frustrating cycle. Spend to stop raids, then spend again when the same raiders returned next season. But not every response was reactive. In some places, Viking raids actually sped up centralisation of power. Weak kings looked bad when their lands burned repeatedly. Stronger kings gained legitimacy by protecting towns or winning battles. Over time, this pressure reshaped political landscapes. A fragmented patchwork of petty rulers couldn't handle the threat effectively. So larger, more organised kingdoms gained an edge. Culturally, the fear left its mark. Chronicles from monks didn't just record dates of raids, they wrote them with the tone of traumatised survivors. Words like heathens and pagans get repeated constantly, painting Vikings as almost supernatural villains. To the average monk, The arrival of longships wasn't just a military problem, it was a spiritual crisis. Why was God allowing pagans to win? The answer often came in the form of self-blame. Maybe society had sinned, maybe the raids were punishment. Either way, it shows how raids warped not just politics, but theology. Practical changes followed as well. Communities that once clustered along rivers began retreating inland. Trade routes shifted to avoid exposure. Even art and literature reflect the anxiety. Images of ships and warriors became shorthand for terror. When people talk about the Viking Age, beginning in 793 with Lindisfarne, it's because the shock wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The irony is that Viking raids, while devastating, also forced Europe to toughen up. Without them, defences might have evolved more slowly. Towns might have stayed vulnerable longer. By hammering coastal and river settlements, Vikings unintentionally accelerated the development of fortified towns, professional armies, and stronger kingships. Fear created innovation, though nobody at the time would have thanked the raiders for it. And still, the fear never fully went away. Even when defences improved, even when ransoms became routine, the sight of dragon-headed ships on the horizon froze communities in place. The unpredictability was part of the terror. You never knew if the ships would pass by or land right in front of you. That uncertainty kept people on edge for generations. So the legacy of Viking fear isn't just castles or taxes. It's the mindset of a continent that had to reorient itself around constant external threat. The phrase, "Deliver us, O Lord," wasn't just piety, it was policy. Ask someone to draw a Viking, and chances are you'll get the same image. A big man, horned helmet, axe in hand, screaming like he's auditioning for a metal album cover. It's dramatic, it's memorable, and it's wrong. Let's start with the horned helmet. Archaeologists have found Viking helmets, but none of them have horns. Zero. The idea of horns didn't pop up until the 19th century, when costume designers for Wagner's operas decided their Viking characters needed extra flair. It looked great on stage, so the image stuck. But in real life, horns on a helmet would have been useless. They'd snag in combat, make it harder to swing weapons, and probably leave you with a broken neck after one solid hit. Practical Norse warriors weren't going to handicap themselves just for fashion. Another myth is that every Viking was a berserker, warriors so frenzied they fought in animal skins and ignored pain. Berserkers did exist, mentioned in sagas and some historical sources, but they weren't the majority. Most Vikings were just regular fighters trying not to die. Imagine if future historians assumed every modern soldier was special forces. It makes a good story, but it oversells reality. Then there's the idea of constant raiding. Popular culture paints Vikings as spending their entire lives on ships, burning down monasteries from Monday to Friday. The truth was more balanced. Most Norsemen were farmers first, raiders second. They worked fields, raised animals, brewed ale, and kept households running. Raiding was seasonal, not year-round. A raid might last weeks or months, but the rest of the year you were threshing grain, not swinging an axe. Weapons also get exaggerated. The double-headed battle axe you see in movies? Pure fantasy. Vikings used single-bladed axes, spears and swords. And swords weren't even common. Iron was expensive. So many fighters went into battle with spears, or farm tools repurposed for war. Not every Viking had a shiny blade. Some were basically fighting with upgraded yard equipment. The dirty barbarian stereotype doesn't hold up either. In fact, Vikings were considered unusually clean for their time. Excavations reveal combs, tweezers, and even ear-cleaning tools in everyday use. Weekly bathing was normal in Scandinavia, compared to much rarer practices in other parts of Europe. One English chronicler even complained that Viking men were stealing local women because they bathed too often and combed their hair. If good hygiene was a weapon, the Vikings used it effectively. Viking democracy is another overlooked reality. While kings and jarls held power, decisions often involved assemblies called things, where free men debated disputes, made laws, and settled conflicts. It wasn't equality by modern standards. Women, thralls, and many outsiders weren't included, but it was still a system of collective decision-making that contrasted with absolute monarchies elsewhere. Speaking of women, their roles were more varied than the myth of passive shield maidens suggests. Women could own land, file for divorce, and manage property. Some evidence even points to women travelling abroad as traders or settlers. The image of Viking society as purely male-dominated raiders misses the complexity of daily life and the authority women could wield at home. Then we get to settlement. Vikings weren't just raiders, they were also colonisers. They established towns in Ireland, founded colonies in Iceland and Greenland, and even reached North America centuries before Columbus. These settlements weren't temporary camps. They built farms, traded with locals, and integrated into existing systems. The stereotype of Viking equals pillager hides the reality that they were also builders, settlers, and neighbours. Even the word Viking is slippery. In Old Norse, Vikinga didn't mean all Scandinavians. It meant someone who went on expeditions overseas, often for raiding or trading. Not every Norse farmer was a Viking. The term described an activity, not an ethnicity. So technically, calling every Scandinavian from 800 to 1100 a Viking is like calling every modern American a soldier. So why did the myths win out? Because they were dramatic. Horned helmets look great in illustrations. Berserkers make for exciting sagas. Brutal raiders capture imaginations more easily than farmers harvesting rye. By the time 19th century artists and nationalists revived Viking imagery, they weren't looking for nuance. They wanted symbols of power and identity. Pop culture followed, and now Vikings are branded merchandise as much as they are historical people. The reality is more interesting. Vikings were raiders, yes, but also traders, settlers, craftsmen, and parents. They weren't mythical beasts or comic book villains. They were human beings navigating a harsh environment with the tools they had, sometimes violently, sometimes cooperatively. Their legacy isn't just fear and fire, but also towns, trade networks, and cultural exchange that shaped medieval Europe. It's tempting to reduce them to legends, but their true story is richer, practical, adaptable, and complicated. The Viking Age wasn't a fantasy of horns and berserks. It was a period of people balancing survival, ambition, and opportunity. Strip away the myths and what's left is still impressive, just in a different way.